Hello and welcome as we now look to the fifth Sunday of Easter. The readings come from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 9, verses 26 through 31. The second reading is from the letter of John, chapter 3, verses 18 and 24. And the gospel comes from the Gospel of John and begins at chapter 15 and gives us verses 1 through 8. Now, I'm going to look a little bit today more on giving a little bit of a précis, a background for the first reading, which is from Acts, and only a little bit really for the gospel today, because the gospel today begins, as I say, verses 1 through 8, but next Sunday picks up right again at 9 through 11. So it will not perhaps need as much explanation or background. Now, as you remember, the story of the Acts is the story of the development of the Christian experience as remembered by the gospel writer Luke, who is, as I remember, the author of the third gospel. And he has written a work which connects, we've mentioned this a few times, the gospel with the Acts, so that it really, we call it Luke Acts as one complete work. Now, the first 8 chapters, and we've mentioned this and seen this a little bit in the discussions we've had thus far, talk about the development of the church in Jerusalem. That is the center of the church. But this would all be changed when a man named Stephen was stoned to death, a martyr, and the man who was present when that happened was a man named Saul. The little episode that talks about the martyrdom of Stephen pictures the people who are doing this, throwing the stones, as placing their cloaks at the feet of a Saul, who watches what is happening. He's not really part of it, but certainly by his presence seems to be giving affirmation to it. This is followed immediately by the fact that Saul, by the way, who later is named, Saul would be his Hebrew name, will be remembered as Paul, which is his Roman name, begins to persecute others who are accepting the Christian way in Jerusalem. Now, exactly just what his persecution turns out to be is unclear. Apparently, what he wants to do is he rounds up those who believe Jesus and presents them to the same leaders who had found Stephen's words and earlier on Peter and John's words as wrong. So he now is pictured, and this is where we'll talk a little bit today. He now pictures, this is Saul, the importance of rounding up all of those who he believes are violating the faith that he had been raised in by accepting this Jesus as Messiah. He goes to the local authorities in Jerusalem and says, I would like to go up to Damascus and bring back those there who are accepting this false way. Now, Damascus at that point was the center of the province of Palestine. As I think I mentioned this before, that at this point in time, from the Roman point of view, Palestine, Syria, Jordan were all part of the same territory and therefore had the same capital, and this was Damascus. So Paul gets permission from the Jerusalem leadership to go up to Damascus and round up those whom he could. On the way, and this of course is the famous story that many remember, on the way an experience happens to Paul that will forever change his viewpoint. This experience, which is recorded, well, really the actual story that we remember in the Acts of the Apostles, and that's what we'll look at a little bit today. Although in another letter, Paul does say that he had some experience of the risen Jesus, but never really describes what it is. So It isn't the only place where this is recorded, but it is the only place where it's described. But following a pattern that Luke seems to like, he not only tells the story of what happens to Paul on the road to Damascus once, but tells it 3 times. So he tells it in the story in the chapter 9, verses 1 through 19, which we'll look at a little bit here. In chapter 22, in verses 1 through 29, but specifically in verses 3 through 21, and in chapter 26, where he tells it again. Each time he tells this story with slight variations, because Luke, as he pictures Paul as telling this story, places into different context. But in the context that we're looking at here, Paul, as I say, is on the road to Damascus to carry out a mission now that he feels he has been commissioned with from the Jerusalem authorities. What exactly happens? Now, this is the way it's described in Acts. As they are going along, a light suddenly appears, so bright that Paul falls down, and he's on the ground. What is also narrated is that his companions with him hear a voice, but they do not see anything. So and it's hard to say what kind of vision, if any, takes place for the sake of Paul. But a voice says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And in this flash of lightning, Paul says, "Well, who am I persecuting? Who are you?" And the voice responds, "Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Now, some will notice that Jesus here could be taken as a group. Not only is it personally Jesus, although I think this is the way that Luke intends this, but could have been all of those who in the city of Jerusalem were being persecuted for their beliefs in Jesus. So there could be a group dynamic there, but more purposely, it seems that Jesus is the one who is responding here. And Jesus says, "You are to go into Damascus, where you will be met by a man who will tell you what to do." And that's this experience. It's an earth-shaking experience for Paul, so much so that he cannot see. When he gets up, he has to be led into the city of Damascus by those who were with him. This is frequently called the conversion of Paul. But I will suggest, as we watch this, and there is a certain discussion that goes on, it isn't simply a conversion, but it is also a commission, a call of Paul. Because what immediately takes place, now all of this which I'm describing from verses 1 to 19 precede the words that we're going to hear in Acts this time, where we'll pick up with verses 26 through 31. But I think it's important to get the kind of full picture of what is happening and why, perhaps for this Sunday, it is chosen to be remembered. Another man, a man in Damascus, also receives a vision from Jesus. His name is Ananias. And he says, that is Jesus to this man, to Ananias, "I am sending you a man whom I have chosen for a specific mission, and I would want you to care for him, to welcome him, to bring him into the community." Ananias' response to this is, this is the guy, Lord Jesus, that's persecuting us. Are you really sure you want me to do this? So Ananias gives the right little objection before you get a message. Don't necessarily accept it without a kind of question. Luke often has that. Remember when Mary is told, "You will be the mother of the Messiah," she says, "Well, I've had no relationships with men." So everyone Or earlier on when Moses had been chosen, he had kind of said to God, wait a minute, I'm not very good at this. So people who are called or chosen often find at first an out, or try to find an out, but it never works, not especially if the Lord is calling you to this. So that's Ananias, what can he do? But Paul led into Damascus to a place called Straight Street. Say that 3 times to see if you can do that. Comes to where Ananias is, and interestingly here, Ananias greets Paul as brother. So already he is kind of welcoming this man whom he really doesn't know, only that he has heard something about from Jesus into the community. Before this happens, Paul, apparently the journey to Damascus had taken a little bit of time, had fasted for 3 days before this encounter. Fasting is always a kind of, again, something that precedes an important event. You will find in the scriptural tradition, just as an aside. So Paul and Ananias meet. The scales that blinded Paul are lifted. He can see. Ananias baptizes Paul, and immediately, and this is what the Acts say, immediately Paul begins the mission of telling the story of Jesus in Damascus, much to the amazement, certainly those Jews in Damascus had heard of, and Christians had heard of Paul's activities, and they too wondered, is Ananias kind of missing something here? But Paul is successful in what he is preaching, because Jesus had said to Ananias, he is my chosen vessel. So although one could see this Damascus Road event as, yes, Paul turning from one way of looking at life to another, that certainly is a conversion. A conversion means, you remember, a 180-degree turn. But I would suggest it also represents the call of Paul to be the messenger, the vessel that God has chosen, or Jesus has chosen, to bring the good news. Now, that's where what we hear this week in the first reading begins, that Paul stays in Damascus. So now this is the viewpoint, by the way, of Luke, who is telling this story, stays in Damascus for some days. Now, you figure out what some days means. For it could be a week, it could be a much longer period of time. And as I mentioned, that Paul had gone to the various different synagogues in Jerusalem and had began to preach the good news of the resurrection. In this way, he takes everyone by surprise. Maybe not Ananias, but everybody else kind of wonders, what's happening here? Who is this guy? Then Luke says, as we will hear, when a sufficient days were fulfilled, that is, however long these days were, some Jews in Damascus were now planning to kill Paul. So the very religion or movement that Paul had been kind of interested in doing is now turned against him. And as we hear, his disciples, now who are these disciples? Are they Paul's disciples? Are they disciples of believers who were already in Damascus, who had accepted Jesus? Help Paul escape the city of Damascus by lowering him in a basket over the walls. Now, what Luke then says is that Paul arrives in Jerusalem. So, however, he gets back there, and when he's in Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples who were there, but they were afraid of him and preferred not to have anything to do with him. It's at this point that a man named Barnabas, we've met Barnabas a couple weeks ago. Barnabas had, you remember, been the one who had sold some property and laid it at the feet of the disciples to help the community in Jerusalem meet its expenses. But Barnabas is a marvelous figure as developed in the Acts of the Apostles, in the sense that he is kind of the broker of things, the middleman, in the best way. Now, I got to be very careful here, but in the best sense of the term, a politician who is able to bring together different groups or different ways of thinking and perhaps find common ground in which to move forward. So it is, as Luke sees it, Barnabas who validates Paul's conversion, what had happened, the Damascus Road experience, and who brings Paul then to the apostles and to the disciples. That's the way in which Luke presents it, as we hear. Paul now is welcomed by the disciples or the apostles. And then, interestingly, as we also will hear, Paul is now even talks to the Hellenist. Remember, maybe you don't, but maybe you remember it was the Hellenist who had been responsible for the death of Stephen. So now Paul, who at that point had kind of agreed what they had done, now turns out that they'd be trying to convert them or help them believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They are determined to kill him. As Luke sees it, people are out to get Paul quite regularly here. And so it is Barnabas who takes Paul down to Caesarea Maritima, which was an important Roman city on at the Mediterranean in Israel. And then from there, make sure that Paul is taken up to Tarsus for the sake of safety. Of course, Tarsus was where Paul had come from. That was his home place. That's the way in which Luke remembers the story. But let me just tell you, and this will not, just as a little bit of background here, there's a different version of what happened here, as is recorded by Paul himself in his letter to the Galatians. In the letter to Galatians, chapter 1, and verses 11 through 24, Paul tells a little different story of what went on here. They agree. He agrees that things in Damascus got kind of tough and he had to be led over the wall in a basket. That's true. But as Paul tells it, I then went to Arabia. Now, Arabia is not where we think, but it's the other side of the Jordan. And he went there for a time. And then he returned again to Damascus, he says, after a period of time. And I was opposed by the king of Damascus, Arestus. And then he had to escape again. Well, really, this is the time in which he escaped over the with the basket bit over the wall. He now goes, says Paul in the letter to the Galatians, I then went up to Jerusalem, and I met with none of the apostles except Cephas, and of course this is Peter. Whenever Paul is not at ease with Peter, he calls him by his Hebrew name, Cephas. So I met with Cephas and James, and they agreed with what I had said, but they thought there was no room for me in the ministry within the church in Jerusalem. So in fact, these two were saying, Paul, just leave. There's nothing here that you can do. And yes, Barnabas accompanied him on the road, but this would take place after 14 years that I went up again to Jerusalem. So Paul tells a very different story of what happened after the initial Damascus Road experience. Now, who's telling the truth? Because, as Paul mentions it in the letter to the Galatians, I was still not known by sight to the churches of Christ in Judea. So Judea would be the whole territory there. Perhaps both of them have a take on what happened here, but the version that we hear from Acts this week is typical of Luke. As I've mentioned before, Luke, kind of the broker, finding a way to bring together groups that do not, even within the Christian believing experience, do not necessarily see things exactly the same way. In that way, Barnabas emerges in Luke's story as a very interesting character. In fact, he calls Barnabas an apostle, so that the term apostle is sometimes limited only to the 12 that are mentioned in the gospel, but others also bore the name of apostles, namely one who is sent. And in that way, Saul, is also an apostle, because as we hear in that story, he is sent to bring the message of the risen Jesus to others. So just that one might notice that there's a divergent viewpoint about exactly how the Jerusalem experience went. From Paul's point of view, there's a bit of a tension. From Luke's point of view, oh, well, we all can get along, and we're so grateful that Paul has got the message and has been brought into the church. So that would be the little section from Acts. And I can encourage you to read the other two accounts, as I mentioned, in chapters 22 and 26 of Acts, where Paul tells the story of the Jerusalem experience, the Damascus experience. By the way, the famous paintings that you will see of Paul's journey to Damascus is that he is thrown off his horse, that the blinding light throws him down. Unfortunately, if you read it carefully, there is no horse in the story. I know some of you know that, but famous paintings show the horse. And if you fall down to the ground, it's certainly much more dramatic to be thrown off a horse than simply to fall down on the ground. So you can see where the artist, one of the famous artists, can kind of develop that and capture the imagination a little bit more, or a little more richly, yes, than otherwise. The gospel comes from chapter 15. Now, just a little bit of a background here. In the Gospel of John, it is, we believe, divided into two essential sections. The first section called the Book of Signs, and the second section, the Book of Glory. The Book of Signs ends with chapter 14, when Jesus is pictured as raising Lazarus from the dead. This is followed when we come to chapter 15, which is known as the period of the hour of Jesus. And much of it, so the hour of Jesus begins with the Last Supper. The Last Supper in John runs from chapter 13, verse 1 to chapter 17, verse 26. So you have 4 chapters really given in John's Gospel to what goes on at the Last Supper. So that's a little bit, again, we may have mentioned this, but a little bit of a background. So the supper begins in chapter 13, with Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. That's the early part of it, verses 1 through 30. Then Jesus begins in 13 verses 31st right to 16:30, which is known as his farewell discourse. So this is a long section in which Jesus gives a great deal of discussion and imagery to the disciples as they are gathered at the Last Supper. By the way, you remember that this is an appropriate term for what Jesus does with his disciples, namely calls it the Last Supper, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke picture it as a Passover meal, a Passover celebration. John, not that that might not have been that, but pictures it rather simply and importantly as a meal with his disciples for the last time. That may explain why in John's Gospel, in 4 chapters, he makes no mention of what we would call the institution of this is my body, this is my blood. Simply not there. Now, what we hear this week, as I mentioned, begins in chapter 15, is the imagery of the vine and the branches. The idea of the vineyard is in a Hebrew Bible, an Old Testament image, often found where God sees Israel as a vineyard, and that the vine carer who takes care of things is none other than God. So Israel is the vine, is the grapes. I think we've mentioned this earlier on in other times. Those of you who are familiar with this know that grapes are a very interesting kind of thing. It takes, when you start a vineyard, you of course have to get it all going up on kind of some kind of fencing and things like that. And then the first couple years, nothing really happens. You just have to be very careful taking care of the vine before it actually produces grapes. But the imagery here is the union of the vines with the branches. Jesus here, of course, is united with all fellow believers. So the true vine, gardener, guy who takes care of things, is the Father. And that's important to notice in this. We will have opportunity to come to look at this again next time when we pick up where this leads from. But it is this important union between the branches and the vine. In a certain way, the branches have no life unless it's connected with the vine. And in that sense, the true vine grower is the Father, but Jesus is the center and the heart from which the branches, who are each one of us, are united. What one might also notice here is that there's mention of pruning. So if you're familiar with this, you have to sometimes cut things off. Those of you even in other who are good into gardening know that sometimes you have to cut off things for the sake of the growth of the whole plant. Well, in this case, the Father has pruned the vineyard, and those who now are left are the ones united with Jesus. So what happens to the parts that are cut off? And well, they're gathered in a bunch and burned and destroyed. So as we hear this week, Jesus is the vine, we are the branches, but it is together that we are called to glorify the Father. This is the one mission. This is the way in which Jesus saw it when he was addressing his disciples at the Last Supper. Remember that this is part of a number of little, dialogues, little homilies, little metaphors that Jesus is pictured as giving his disciples on the night before he would suffer and die. Jesus the vine, we are the branches. So this week we are invited to stay loyal, linked, and always united with Jesus and thus with one another. Thank you. Hope to see you again.